I'm Shane O'Toole, and I'm part of DoCoMoMo, and we're delighted that Emma has allowed us to host this event here in association with the Eileen Gray exhibition, which closes tomorrow. And it's really exciting to have Mary McGuckian, Irish film director from Northern Ireland, who has worked with so many of the world's great stars. Her last film, 2011, was The Man on a Train, starring Donald Sutherland and Larry Mullen Jr. And now this year, her new film, The Price of Desire, about Eileen Gray, will come out. Mary, where did you get an interest in Eileen Gray? What started all of that?
Gracious. Like many people, I was aware of her as a great Irish designer, but didn't really know the story. And over the years, inevitably people say, well, you're Irish and you're female and you speak French, and why are you not doing the Eileen Gray story? And I'd kind of look at it and I'd read the little bit that we all know, bisexual Irish designer, architect, built a house in the south of France, had a bit of a barney with Corbusier, and I'd go, I don't know what the story is. And then when I really did look at it, it felt like a story for a while, like many kind of persons of Irish import. An example to me was there's a reason why the Yeats and Morgan story has never been made into a film, which is there isn't much drama in it. And so I kind of took a while to figure out what really was the story. I spent a lot of time down around the south of France near the house, loved the house, had a little bit of a space of time and thought, okay, I'll put some time into it and see if I can find the story. And after a few weeks, or a few months, a few months of reading and research and talking to people, it started to emerge to me that there seemed to be a story worth telling that was cinematic enough to have resonance as a universal female experience. And that was really around what we know, which is the constant first issue that comes up around Eileen Gray. How did somebody of such ingenuity and innovativeness and independence and extraordinary achievement remain unrecognised for so long? And so in a way, the film became the emotional exploration of that, rather than the factual exploration, because we all have speculative reasons as to why that happened.
Yeah, because I mean, you must be walking on eggshells in a lot of ways taking this on, because the house E1027 is, it's a battleground between the Corbusiers on one side and the Gray fans on the other side, and there is no real common ground or meeting ground there. You must imagine that, this is people are going to come out of the woodwork and attack whatever you do about what Caroline Constant has called a fictional recreation of this.
I hope not now, because it took us so long, and we spent so much time with all of the different organizations and people involved. And while some bodies were buried along the wayside, the timing was good. There was just something in the air, or l'air du temps, as Eileen Gray would have called it, allowed for there to be this kind of confluence of activities from the collector side, the exhibition, the Pompidou interest, the various changes in the organizations responsible for historic monuments in France, the fantastic community of architects worldwide who have an interest in her, and the modern design producers, not allowed to say reproducers, producers of contemporary furniture. And the confluence of interest and generosity of spirit, particularly around the younger academics involved in the more recent research around Eileen Gray, all sort of came together around the same time the film was coming together and the documentary. And so it does feel like that we've all been part of a process that is starting to accept and quieten down, get to the grips with really what happened and come to a common understanding and acceptance in a way of, and it's grey, it's not black and white, what happened between Badovici, Eileen Gray and Corbusier. And there are people beg to differ rather than, I feel, more than that there's a great debate or a great argument going on. The argument is over. Certainly, when I started 3 years ago, Mr. Rubatato, who lives in the cafe beside, had a very strong view that he really would not accept that, and he would have a lot of influence on the Fondation Corbusier.
Of course.
He would not accept that the house was Eileen Gray's sole work, and he felt that Corbusier's influence and work in the house was more important than the house and the work itself. I would argue that in the last 3 years he has fundamentally changed his position.
Wow.
And that is, and that has affected the position of many of the organisations and people around the debate of the practical reality of how to deal with the house, and the debate around how to restore the house or open it to the public, which of course still isn't resolved, but it's getting there in that long-winded French way.
So, but you've written one film, you're directing one film, but you're actually producing 2 films at the moment. Yeah. There's a documentary. So tell us a little bit about that, and then tell us about The Price of Desire and the difference between the two, and what freedom maybe the documentary gave you.
Well, it does hugely in that it became clear you couldn't undertake a subject like this without a great deal of research, and that was done with the cooperation of a phenomenal number of people internationally.
Like who?
Like yourself, like the wonderful Jennifer Goff here in Ireland, who's probably the world expert, darling Caroline Constant, who wrote the most important book on Eileen Gray's architecture. Chloe Pichot, who then took up the mantle in the Pompidou as the curator of that exhibition, which is now here at IMA, and very much a joint effort with Jennifer, and she would concur with that. Then a very wide range of academics in the various museums that hold archives, plus people. We're still at the stage where there are people who knew Eileen Gray.
Right.
There are very few people who knew Eileen Gray, and the few that suggest that they did know her maybe didn't know her as well as they say they did. So we had this, and there were enthusiasts, and we've discovered a lot of material and a lot of wealth of information just from amateur enthusiasts who were prepared to go and do research that had never been done before, particularly around Vézelay, the town in the middle of France, where she did a lot of work and owned a lot of property that isn't really very well known. I'd say there were some 500 people involved in this exercise, and so it's very
in the research exercise.
In the research and development exercise. Wow. And so it became clear that, to do justice to the project, it became clear that a fictional feature film would never do justice to that work and the importance of the revision of the revisionary research that was being done, not just by us, but also by the Pompidou and by Jennifer, particularly here at the National Museum of Ireland. And so it seemed that it would be crazy not to, with everything else that was going on over the last 12 months, to miss out on that opportunity. So I asked a very experienced documentary maker who happened to know a lot of the people, particularly around, it's his world, the art world, would he take this on?
This is Marco Orsini?
Marco Orsini, and he set off a year ago, he's been filming on and off for a year, to make sure that he didn't miss anything or anybody. And so what is emerging is, which did give me huge freedom, a really revisionary, very comprehensive documentary on the entire work of Eileen Gray. And he's called it Gray Matters, thanks to Frank MacDonald's article. And really,
Frank would be pleased to hear that.
No, I don't think we asked him, but that was all right. And it is a documentary that really sets out the argument that Eileen Gray matters, as in she has contemporary relevance on all kinds of levels, and the entire canon of contemporary experts worldwide have contributed to this documentary.
Fabulous.
It's a phenomenon. It gave me huge freedom because while biography is a very complicated area in film, I have a very strong view that cinema must reach an audience on an emotional level. We don't take massive license. Eileen Gray did us a huge favor, in a way.
In disappearing?
Yeah, well, in deciding that she left the legacy of her work. Right. As we know, she destroyed her private papers, intentionally. So out of respect, you kind of didn't want to go into that. So the film really tries to be documentary. The feature film. Yeah, the documentary is
covers her whole life.
Her
whole story.
Her work, really, her entire work.
Right.
It's not a chronological documentary about Eileen Gray was born here.
Yeah.
It's a comprehensive visual catalogue raisonné with expert opinions on her work, really presenting the argument that Eileen Gray is one of the most important influences on contemporary design and architecture. And it uses her entire canon of work to do that.
Well, it can only increase her
Yeah,
importance
exactly.
to future designers. So
Whereas the feature film
now.
it's a story, and it's the story of really it's more chronological in a way. It spans 50 years, and it's her story. It's the story of how she really it's the story of her relationships told through the eyes of Le Corbusier. As to how
is he the narrator in the film? Then?
He's more than a narrator. He is a little bit like Salieri and Amadeus. He's the kind of alter ego nemesis. Well, because as we know, Corbusier was an invention of his own making, and his real name was Charles Généré, and he had this rather extraordinary personality. We were able to tell the story through his alter ego. So Vincent Perez, who plays Le Corbusier, in fact plays two characters. Okay. And so he tells the story of from his point of view, of how Eileen Gray came to be the most important inspirational and innovative architect of their generation, and gives her back the right to be recognized for that work. That's the cinematic license.
And then why is it called The Price of Desire? It's
called The Price of Desire because well, two reasons. The flip reason is that, as you all know, a lot of us a lot of the world started to pay attention to Eileen Gray at the point at which, the headlining story of the sale of her dragon chair in Paris.
Is the Yves Saint Laurent
Le Berger sale. The dragon chair sold for 19.7 million euros, which in fact was about 21 million euros when you added the tax. It was bid for by a long-time Eileen Gray collector called Cesca Valois from Galerie Valois in Paris.
Did she actually sell that chair to Yves Saint Laurent in the first place?
Originally, according to her, she did. In 1972, she sold the chair on behalf of the Doucet collection. It was auctioned. Right. It was part of the Jacques Doucet collection, and that collection was auctioned much in the same way as Yves Saint Laurent and his collection, the Yves Saint Laurent Berger collection was auctioned on Yves Saint Laurent's death, and Yves Saint Laurent bought it for this large sum of money in 1972. And at that point, everybody in Paris went, "Who's Eileen Gray?" including Bruce Chatwin, who famously saw this and looked her name up in the phone book, found her, rang her up, and went round for tea. And subsequently, the chair came up for sale again at Yves Saint Laurent or at Christie's, and it reached this extraordinary price. And Cesca was bidding.
This is just 5 years ago.
This was in 2009, yeah, February 2009. And Cesca, I hope I'm right, it was 2008 or 2009? 2009. And Cesca bid on behalf of a client who remains anonymous to this day, and there's much speculation as to who it was. And
I was saying to you just outside that at the wrap party in Paris for the film, the end of the shooting in the Irish Embassy, the ambassador, I think it was, said, one of the speakers officially said anyway, that the underbidder was Irish. So we're all dying to know who that was.
Apparently that was true. And the bidding started at about, I think, 2 million.
Yeah.
And there were 3 bidders on telephones up to 4.5 million. And then Cesca started bidding at 4.5 million. And the other, at 5 million, the 3 people on the phone the 3 phone bidders stopped. And then and she thought she had it for already an extraordinary price. And then another phone was picked up, and apparently it was an Irish bidder who continued up to 20 million euros.
In 1919.
Yeah. 19.5.
Yeah.
And 19, officially, and then recognised that when it got to 20, or effectively 19.5, that Cesca must have carte blanche, which she did have.
Wow.
And her husband didn't even know. And he's a very famous bidder. He was sitting beside her going white in the face. and he's still in fright, I think, to this day, that she did that without telling anybody in front of thousands of people in the Grand Palais.
So your film then covers, what, the last 45, 50 years of
Eileen's life? As films can, it jumps around.
Right.
So it starts at that auction in Paris. It then goes back to the early 70s, when Joseph Reichardt and there was a sudden, because of the first sale of the house, it was a little interesting.
It was Joseph who rediscovered
Eileen Gray in 1968 and wrote the article in Domus, and then Joseph Reichardt, the Rayons, who were students at the time, 2 French architectural students, were walking around the south of France, visiting Corbusier's cabinet, saw the house, wondered about it, and then vaguely remembered reading Reichardt's article. And they took a lot of photographs, many of which you can find online, which are horrendous photographs of the house in great decay. And then when they heard about Eileen Gray in Paris as a result of the sale, they went to see her and they showed her the photographs, which was very upsetting to her.
So that's that scene in the film
that
where
is where
she's the old lady,
she's
looking at the slides.
So the film goes, and then it jumps right back to her Monte Carlo room days. It's very much the story of the modernist. It's Eileen Gray, the really inspired and innovative modernist, and how she gave herself license eventually to train herself autodidactly as an architect. She had no formal training, and to take on the project of this house E1027. So it's very much around the house E1027 and the relationship with Corbusier.
And I mean, so you shot the film in the house.
We shot half the film in the house.
The house has been controversial. Its restoration has been enormously controversial in France, with different architects at different stages proposing different strategies, and even some of the restoration that has been undertaken recently by Gattier and his team has been heavily criticised for the clunky details of some of the replacement that has gone in, and the restoration is not complete. How did you even get? Nobody can get into the house. How did you get access to film?
It was
there?
what I remember
And what
meeting
did you do?
there 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and that was when we had just started. It took a long time, and of course we walked right into that nightmare of who was responsible for the house, who was the gérance or the management of the house, who owned it, what state the restoration was at. And somehow, over a long period of time, we managed to get all the different organizations to the table, and somehow they convinced themselves that allowing a movie to shoot there and to be partly responsible for helping them complete the restoration was a good idea. And there seemed to be enough people with that notion that we were able to move along. It had its challenges, and the practical reality was we found ourselves, and my design team, who luckily were my production designers, both women, were trained as architects.
Academy Award winners.
And one of them Academy Award winner, the other, both very French-trained architects with masters and backgrounds in historic monuments. So that was just lucky, and they managed to create relationships with our architects involved. But we got into and because they were partly restoring and partly re-restoring all the way through our development process, we ended up, most of our project was about figuring out and agreeing what we would restore, what we would change and put back, what we agreed should be changed, what other organizations agreed should or shouldn't be. So,
because you've got to shoot the house before the murals arrive, as well as with
after,
the murals.
Yeah. And so we started to become part, which is very beyond the remit of a feature film. We started to become part of this restoration project discussion. So in the end, we had a protocol, a list, a very big document of not just what we were going to do, but how it was going to be done and how it was going to be supervised. And that became, I've never seen an art department have such a detailed, usually you go into a location, you sign an insurance agreement. By the way, don't ever allow a film crew into your house. But you take the care that you take. You sort out the insurance. You say, look, we do an état de lieux, as they say. We have there's an independent expert who establishes the state of the location. You go and you shoot there. You leave, and then hopefully everything's put back the way it was meant to be. This was a whole other level. This was, it was a real privilege to get to do this.
You were shooting there, for about 6 weeks last summer?
We were shooting there for 6 weeks, but we were in there for months before with a whole crew. While I was shooting in studio in Belgium, we had this pre-agreed crew. I suppose what happened was there were certain things that they needed to complete restoration-wise that had become blocked, as you know, because of the bureaucracy in France.
And so your film accelerated
and unblocked that because they were able to say, because the film needed things to be done, that they could be done by the crew that we would bring in. Whereas to unblock funds and put out offre d'appel, as they go, they had to use local workmen, and they were not managing to, I don't know why, but they were not managing to find the level of work and to manage it in a way that had the things done the way they were meant to be done. It's a whole range of things, from how, restorations of wall murals, the famous light switches, which were a huge issue in all over the French press. Is it to be restored or preserved? Is it, and lots of details about the work that had been done, window frames that were supposed to have been restored and gone rusty again, then we were asked to do them in a certain protocol, the way we were asked to do them, the manufacturers of the paint. Even, I'd be in a shooting in studio, I'd be getting these calls about painting protocols for leadening of window frames that have been remaining, and I go, what? And so we'd have to get so many people to sign off on all of this, and this would go on every night all through the shoot.
And meanwhile, you've got actors booked, so things have to be finished by a certain, because you've got to get in on a certain day.
And then be able to move, do what the film needed to do, which was show the house for everything from building it to 1922 to when she finished it, to before the war, to during the war, to after the war, to Le Corbusier's thing. So there was a 40-year kind of aging of the house that we had to do without affecting the house, and at the same time rendering, completing this partial contribution to the restoration project. It was complicated.
It sounds a lot more complicated than a building project. It's actually a building project is just the first step before you can do your own work.
Yeah, so much sensitivity, as you know, around the house and around
the world watching.
And the world watching it. And
can I ask you a rude question now? No. What is the budget for a film like this if you're doing that as just preparatory?
It's always too much. For that, it inflated our art department quite dramatically, but we had a lot of support, particularly from particularly Aram and Classicon, the companies.
They came
in to help,
Because you're funding, it's a joint Irish-Belgian production.
It's a joint Irish-Belgian production, but what we were doing for the house, of course, was and a lot of public funding, so we couldn't use film money to restore a house, to restore the location. So we had to be very defined between what was actually work that we were doing that really the film would have to do anyway, and what we were doing because the organisation wanted us to do it, and we wanted to do it. So we had to kind of define those two things and then fund that separately. So it's complicated.
Complicated.
Yeah, but it was a great fun thing to do.
Can you tell me now about the characters and what you felt about the characters and how you went about casting?
Yeah.
And how long does that process take, and what sort of direction are you giving people? And because I think, you had one or two actors come in and went out, and so can you talk a little bit about just about that process? What were you looking for from your actors?
The casting of Eileen Gray became a huge issue because inevitably you put together a certain level of a budget for a film, and there is this very kind of nonsense thing that goes on as to what an actor is worth. There is the reality of, and it's a separate debate, and I suspect it goes on in architecture. I think there's some architects in the audience.
There are.
There are not. The big debate in the film world is the lack of female characters, single character narratives with female characters. Never mind the lack of female directors. And it has been my experience as a filmmaker over 12 or 14 films, whatever it is, that it has been almost impossible for me to every project that I've ever set out to make that has a female character as the lead has been almost impossible to get off the ground. And so I tried to deal with that in this instance in two ways. One was to suggest that we would way overcast the role, in terms of the bankability of the actors, which is a horrible thing to take on. And to do that and yet render the film authentic and the characterization of Eileen Gray authentic was always going to be a challenge. And the second was by making it almost a dual narrative, even though it's a single character narrative about Eileen Gray, by bringing this element of Le Corbusier. So on the European side, very early on, I cast Vincent Perez. He's Swiss originally. He was very authentic and right to play the role. He's a huge star in France. He was really committed to the project. He did an extraordinary study. He must have a PhD in Corbusier at this stage. And
you said to me once, I think, that he spent a year getting ready for the role?
Yeah, mm-hmm. And over a year. And to pitch it where that he wouldn't be entirely unempathetic was always going to be a challenge, which I'm really pleased. He's done an extraordinary job. But the casting of Eileen Gray in a film that didn't want to, part of the thesis of the film, we were talking about the title, The Price of Desire, going back to that. We're going to step back again to the auction in Paris.
At the Grand Palais.
At the Grand Palais. Cheska walked out of the auction. The world press came around her and said, what chair in the world could possibly be, some bad word, worth this amount of money? And it just came out of her mouth. She said, oh, it was the price of desire. And that headline went round the world. And she's been answering questions about that ever since. It felt like a flip remark, but actually it had a lot of resonance in it. It came out of the mouth of a woman who'd spent 30 years of her life working on Eileen Gray's work. As a collector and as a dealer. And when I thought about it, somewhere that was my underlying thesis about Eileen Gray, is that part of what informed her work was the integrity of her artistry, and the integrity of her artistry had this kind of sixth sense, and to me that sense was her sensuality. And there is this kind of perceived notion that Eileen Gray was this very tight, kind of Anglo-Irish, sort of very prim character, and my feeling is that that's not the case. That was not the case. That she had great humor and great, even though she was a very private person. And this is conversation.
But she was private later in her life. She was a recluse, but she was wild.
She was
in
wild
the 20s,
in her youth.
Yeah.
And so the Price of Desire as a title seemed to have some resonance. So like Marco asked Frank for the Grey Matters title, I asked Cheska for the Price of Desire title, and then went on to have to justify that title. To justify the title, it needed an actress of some sensuality who was not going to do a Kristen Scott Thomas and play this kind of very prim, not Kristen's great actress in certain roles, but that it would be somebody who could bring that kind of integrity of spirit and sensuality to the role. Then on the other side, we had the bankability issue. It was as if for a year and a half, Eileen Gray was watching from above as to who was going to get to play this part. We went through 35 actresses.
35, because when we met 2 years ago, you told Frank and I that Winona Ryder was going to...
That was one of 35.
Was going to play.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't mean 35 actresses as ideas. I mean actresses who signed up, started work, started learning French. Some were paid. It was unbelievable. And one after another, for whatever reason, and all kinds of different reasons, either the French wasn't working, or they couldn't, or they got frightened of the role, or one after another, they fell out.
They dropped out.
One after another.
And
it was incredible.
You were casting.
I've never had
you were casting in America and in Europe.
Everywhere. Spain, France, Italy, America. Every actress you've ever heard of looked at playing this role. And a week before 2 weeks before shooting, the final actress who had now spent 2 months, been escrowed, been 50 lawyers over a deal, the whole bit, had a complete nervous breakdown. And the one actress who should have got to play her, who was authentically right to play her, was never being approved. And she was also a friend of mine, which made it even more difficult. Right. And 10 days before shooting, she was the only person in the world who could possibly get it together to play
Orla
her.
Brady.
Yeah.
She only stepped into the role 10 days before.
10 days before shooting. And there was a point about 3 months before shooting where a previous actress had dropped out, and I was we were trying to see, would it work for her time-wise, and would I get all the distributors to agree and all the rest of it. And we arranged to meet in Paris, as it happened. She was in London, I was somewhere down shooting or preparing somewhere. And about a day before we were, to have a really proper long weekend on the script.
She had seen the script and everything like that, yeah.
And the day before, it was made clear to me that this was not going to work. So I had to ring her up and say, look, it's not going to work. By
distributors or backers?
And this is very confident. I don't know why I'm going into all this. Anyway, and we know each other a long time, and we kind of had the coincidence, and she kind of knew this was the case. And it was actually this day last year in the Pompidou. It was the night before the closing of the Pompidou. Wow. And so I was going to Paris for a series of lectures by much more eminent people than me. And Orla had thought, she'd love to go and do that and see the exhibition on the last day and do all of that. And so we had the call the day before, and we just said, you know what, heck, we haven't seen each other so long, why don't we go to Paris anyway? So we both landed into the Pompidou at 7 o'clock of a Friday evening. She has not seen any of this, lands straight in, sits through 4 hours of lectures from all the people who wrote those wonderful essays in the Pompidou book.
So she was getting a crash course in Eileen Gray.
Crash course in Eileen Gray. Sat through the whole thing, then we had very late dinner, chatted away, it was just, and I was going away thinking, this is so wrong. Anyway, off she went back to do the other film she was doing. But she stayed on I had to leave very early in the morning, and she stayed on. She didn't tell me this, she at the time. And she actually went back to the Pompidou for the rest of Saturday and spent the whole day in the exhibition. She was the only one of the 35 actresses who'd actually been to the exhibition. Right. Or who knew enough about her. Apart from the fact she speaks English, she speaks French, she's the right age, she looks beautiful, all of those things.
She looks amazing.
She looks amazing.
In the film.
She's amazing.
And she has to play Eileen Gray from 45 to 90?
From about 30 to 96. It is the most phenomenal aging performance I've ever seen. She's done an extraordinary job. Anyway, I only tell you the story about her going to the exhibition because when this came up again, and I knew we were running into trouble, and she just came up on Skype one night about 2 weeks before shooting, and we started having the chat, and I said, I have a feeling something's wrong. And it wasn't even as simple as 10 days before. She had to get on a plane from LA to Paris to be ready to play a role that she wasn't sure she had.
Right.
And at that point she said, the day I was walking around the exhibition, that was when she told me she'd gone to the exhibition.
The second day, yeah.
She said, I had a funny feeling that it hadn't gone away.
This is what you've always said, that Eileen Gray was watching this thing, yeah.
And so this whole thing started. You can imagine lawyers and agents going, you're not getting on a plane to Paris for a part you don't have. Anyway, she did. And so then we got into this whole thing that we started, and the other thing for always was the cutting the hair. So we decided, so we had this kind of deal that the commitment would be that the day we were absolutely sure she was doing it,
chop, chop.
Chop, chop, chop. So that's what happened.
Amazing.
So it was a very ritualistic haircutting. On a particular day, which is also a scene in the movie. Anyway, I don't know if all of that's interesting, but that's the kind of stuff that went on.
It's amazing. I mean, I'm going to throw it open to you all in a moment, but just, can you tell us what stage the film's at, when we're likely to see it?
It's desperately trying to finish itself. So we're probably 3 months away. We're still trying to finalise the picture. We have a wonderful Irish composer who lives in America called Brian Byrne, along with Alanis Morissette, a Canadian singer in the film, and Julian Lennon, who did amazing
Julian did
stills,
all the stills, which are staggering.
Beautiful. Yeah. And they're all starting the music and the sound, so we're all in the middle of all of that bit.
And of course, I should say that the third component, because there are the two films,
yes,
the third component is Stony Road Press are going to make a publication, limited edition of Julian's.
In fact, now they've decided 4 chapters, which they're going to call E10, 2 and 7, of limited edition box sets of the stills. But because those things are always so expensive, they're also going to do a book and then create an exhibition around it. Right. The stills are amazing. There were 8,000 stills. We're having a hard time picking the stills.
8,000 stills.
Yeah, beautiful stills.
Yeah.
Anyway,
if anybody would like to ask a question, please put up your hand and I'll point you. And then there's no microphone, so you can just feel free to ask away if anyone has any particular question to ask.
I'll ask a question.
You do? Yeah, good for you.
Do people think that they would go and see a movie about Eileen Gray because it's Eileen Gray? Yeah. And more a documentary or the film or both? Interesting, isn't it?
Interesting.
Yeah.
It is.
And they are two very different things.
But I think it's really interesting the Irish connections that you have more or less insisted on or fallen into with this film, because I mean you've written, you're directing, producing, you've got Orla as the lead character. No, but I mean the work has been done here in Windmill Lane.
The post-production's being done here. It filmed in studio in Belgium and on location in Vézelay. Yeah. And then at E1027 under Round Rock Bruncab Martin. It's in English and French.
How does that work? Yeah, I mean, is it subtitled or what way?
It isn't.
But it will be.
It will. In the English version, the French will be subtitled. In the French version, the English will be subtitled.
So did you shoot everything in 2 languages?
No, it's just the film. It's a kind of a current fashion, and it really worked for this. What they call the posh word is language authentic. It is that the characters spoke English when it made sense to speak English, and French when it made sense to speak French. And as you would have expected that they would have. So it's ended up being about half and half. Right. So because we believe that Eileen Gray's relationship with Badovisi probably started in English and then developed into French as Badovisi got better in French.
And you have her shouting on the teaser about the boys' club, and she says that in English.
Yes, and sometimes she came out with English and sometimes she came out with French. I'm guessing, as we all do when you're a bit mixed up. And then Corbusier famously spoke French. He was Swiss originally, but he undid his Swiss accent and spoke French in a very proper sort of academic way.
So that meant Vincent Perret didn't actually have to be Swiss. He didn't need a Swiss accent.
No, he needed the and then he spoke English. I mean, if you listen to it, it's like John Cleese and Fawlty Towers. So we couldn't do that, or there would be a comedy. Yeah. So we had to find a way to kind of approach that. But he did not forgive the English thing. I mean, it's as if he's reading English in a French accent. It's very, very funny the way he spoke English. But he spoke it very well, but incomprehensibly so, with this strange accent. And then Badovisi was Romanian and had a bit of an accent. The whole language vocal thing has been very interesting.
So, I mean, you did sound research or oral research on that so that the actors would know
we had to do all that,
what to do.
Yeah.
Wow. Then in terms of shooting on the set in Belgium, I guess that's partly because it's a Belgian co-production. I mean, might be why we'll be there. But what did you shoot there? And, for example, in relation to E1027, is everything about E1027 on location, or did you also
It was very simple. Yeah, it ended up being, as we know, the houses exist, E1027 and Tempa Paya.
Okay, so you shot there.
So we shot in Tempa Paya as well. Well, in fact, we shot the exterior of Tempa Paya at Tempa Paya, and the interior we had to build because that has changed. But we built it in the south of France. And we shot, so really the three locations for Eileen Gray were, if you think, her Parisian interiors, Vézelay, and then her houses in the south of France. So everything that was a Parisian interior, none of that exists anymore. So we faithfully recreated all that in studio in France. Well, faithfully, and then kind of, I mean, it is an art, in Belgium. I mean, the other kind of very tough rule that I gave the art department was that the entire film had to, the look of the film is inspired by the Eileen, a sort of a cinematic version of the Eileen Gray aesthetic. And then the call for the team was to take that simple, functional, elegant aesthetic that they were creating and only use Eileen Gray furniture and Eileen Gray interiors.
So were you dealing with reproductions then, or did you get access to?
That was a whole other project. Furniture was a big project. We had to,
because even finding out who some of the collectors are is a real trick, because you don't get the names at the auction results.
Some collectors did offer to lend. It was not feasible to borrow beautiful pieces. For example, the mermaid chair, which they really wanted us to have in the film, but it travels with two handlers. It costs $10,000 a day to insure it, or whatever it was. And it would be a lovely idea, and then you can't sit on it. So it kind of wasn't very useful. So we had to get permission to recreate each of the lacquer collector pieces. And then all of the modern pieces that are in production were especially reproduced again in the style in which we needed them of the
earlier prototypes.
And then we've had the wonderful Jennifer here and all of those picking through. Emma and Anne, who are the designers, are both Paris-based, so they were able to do a lot of research. So it was certainly our intention, and I believe and hope we've got there, that in terms of the work and the furniture and the interiors, that it's incredibly authentic. But the emotional story for the cinema version is inevitably fictionalized. But it's all based on fact, and the look is based on fact. So the documentary is an interesting combination, and I haven't been able to follow.
Have you been seeing the roughs or the
I've
rushes?
I've seen some interviews. He has hours and hours and hours of it. I haven't been able to watch it all yet, but it's been funny because he's been. There's been this ongoing research in the back, and the two films are sort of meeting in an interesting way.
Because on that last day of shooting, I mean, both crews were shooting the same scenes at the same time. Yeah. And one was being in the other's film. Yeah. It was bizarre. and one particular day at E1027, they were there as well, which was cramped. Yeah. Robin.
Yes. Like I said, every film takes a good, you do have to give a certain amount of time and energy, and it's a good question. I'm always conscious as you get older, you don't just do any project because they do eat up a period of your life, and you kind of think, well, I need to be convinced that I need to convince myself that there's a really, really fundamentally good reason to make this film, that it will have an audience and that it has something to say. And so, you know, at the beginning when you asked the question, there was no great moment of, yes, I must make a film about Eileen Gray. It just sort of caught up on me. And the moment at which I guess I felt it was worth making was when I felt I could find a story that had something universal to say within the Eileen Gray story. And what it seemed to be, sorry, do you want to?
But you live nearby, I mean, so it was...
Oh, I do, I'm very aware of her. I have a house quite near her, and so I walk past the house very often. And when I looked at the story and really researched it, it felt to me that there was something to say about the universal female experience, particularly for creative women. And in you know, without being kind of too caught up, but that there was something emotionally important to tap into that a documentary couldn't unveil on its own.
What is that? Because you said that at the beginning.
Did I? Okay. Well, I suppose I always find it very hard to explain, and that's why you need a movie to do it. But it feels like it is. I mean, for want of, I don't know. Even I'm almost inventing a term here, but you know, we're all trying to. When we all look at it, we all go, well, why was it? You know, the architecture was so inventive. It was. She was the first to do it. She did set out. When we can quibble over whether she built the first modern house or not, she certainly started building before Corbusier started building. It was more than, it was a house that was more than just a modernist house according to the 5-point plan. It was a house that was commenting on the ideology around the 5-point plan. It was more than just a piece of architecture. It was a whole way of life, it had the kind of relationship between interior and exterior never emerged.
And a critique of the machine for living.
And a critique of the machine for living, exactly. So why is it that, you know, what are we now, 90 years almost since that she started designing that house, only now starting to recognize the extraordinary contribution of this woman to a century of design and architecture? That was my question to myself. And it seemed to me that the answer lay in a lifetime story. And the lifetime experience of Eileen Gray was a combination of her, the time she lived in, the personality that she was, and somewhat, you know, somewhat due to, somewhat the experience that many female artists have, and for want of a better word, I think and many female people in a working environment have, which is, for want of a better word, this notion of, somebody once called it insidious chauvinism. No great event, no great wrongdoing, just a lifetime of little omissions, remarks, forgetfulnesses.
Yeah, but I mean, it's completely natural in the case of Eileen Gray, because I mean, she left the house, you know, 1938 or whenever, or the murals came in 38. She was even gone before then.
Yeah.
Then Le Corbusier, immediately after the war, when he published the next volume of his work, the last pages are images, photographs of the mural, which he talks about painting this mural in this villa, which had these dull white walls that they didn't need any enlivening, but he brought life to it. He doesn't mention the name of the house, he doesn't mention Eileen Gray, he only mentions his murals. So he's already, in a way, writing her out immediately after the war. He then becomes very possessive about the house, and he found Madame Shelbert to buy the house. Yeah. I mean, when the house needed a protector, he found a Swiss patron and persuaded her to buy the house so that his murals would be safe and the house would be safe. He built his cabanon beside it and the Rebetatus buildings beside it. He died underneath it, swimming, or went out for that swim in 1965. And people Eileen Gray had disappeared. I mean, as Joseph Rickford said in 1968, it was 30 years since anybody had written or honoured Eileen Gray in any way. And the last person in 1938, he said, was Le Corbusier.
Yeah. Erroneously.
But erroneously. There were some
There
mistakes in that essay, but
yeah.
I mean, even the date of the murals. But like, she had been totally forgotten. Nobody knew Eileen Gray had designed a house. Even that was lost to memory. Most people thought it was an early house by Le Corbusier. And the little pathway that runs by the house was called Promenade
Chemin de Le Corbusier,
Chemin
which
de
it still is.
Le
to this day.
Corbusier. Le Corbusier. So, I mean, she was obliterated by him, but at the same time, he protected her work.
Unwittingly, perhaps,
Had the murals, I
subconsciously.
think, had the murals not been painted, had he not found the buyer for the, had he not built the cabinet beside it, it would probably all have gone.
Perhaps. I mean, that's an argument that's often made,
It's almost
and
like
it's not wrong.
it's almost like he was a collector of Eileen Gray, because she was before him, wasn't she? I mean, she was a star.
She was a star,
he
and
was.
you've effectively told the story of the film, because that is the whole story of the film.
Right.
All of those events. It's very well done. You do much better than I do. And I guess the difference is
You should get me to write the press
Yeah,
release.
actually, it was really good. All of that's in the movie. And I guess the difference is, as a series of chronological events, you get that there's a level of injustice about it. I suppose, and a documentary can recite all of that. But what
a drama,
what does that feel like? Is a different question. In hindsight, we can see that's what happened.
Right.
But when she was in the middle of it, there were years between each of those events.
Yeah.
Time went on, relationships were involved, and now we look back and it looks like that's what happened. But in the day-to-day of it, how do you get to a place where you put your life's energy and expertise and emotional energy into a piece of work, and then you walk away? How do you get to that place? And
it's an interesting question. I mean, for you as a writer and a director in trying to get, to the inner Eileen Gray, if you like, rather than the work, which involves lots of dialogues and meetings and interchanges with people who were real, but nobody recorded them at the time. So what sort of liberties do you take with dialogue and with scenes and with personal events and private events in life? What is there a limit as a director to where you go, an artistic limit, or how do you address those?
It depends how you go about it, and people go about it in different ways. I mean, some people take a real life story and then turn it into a drama, and they take what's called dramatic license. Because this is an art piece and it's intended to be inspired by and to an extent elucidate a cinematic visual experience that is inspired by her aesthetic, it was important to me that this particular film be more of an art piece that was very carefully informed by and inspired by her work. And in somewhere she intended that. And a contemporary biography, even in written biography, tends to try to this is constant debate, is biography that is let's research that and explain the life of a person so we can understand the work, or how does the work inform the person. For a movie, I chose to have the work, and there is writing that exists. So everything in the film is, even the dramatic
dialogue
film, is all inspired by actual writing or sayings or literature that she was reading or events, but as much as possible connected to her work. So it's not a very dialogue-driven film.
Right.
There's a little bit of it, but it is very. You'll have to see it.
We will have to see it. So tell us about the release date, and are there any... I mean, how do you go about it? Is it about festivals? Is there a release date? Is there a time when it might come to Ireland? I mean, where does it go first? Or how do those things work?
We don't know where it's going to go first, because we still haven't finished, and we're not letting anybody see anything, so the distributors are still waiting to decide. But they'll go the normal course of release dates. It'll be next autumn.
Next autumn.
Will be the release date, but they'll start doing the festivals from about May.
Right.
Yeah. If I get it finished.
Would Cannes be a wonderful place to start?
Yeah, Cannes is a tough one, because Cannes is very competitive and it's quite cruel to films. Right. And it's not necessarily the best place to launch a movie. But then if you're invited, you go.
Absolutely.
So who knows?
Well, I guess
Yeah.
a lot of people in the south of France would like to celebrate
Yeah,
a film
exactly,
that's set
yeah.
there. I hope.
And certainly there feels like there'll be a lot of opportunity. There are a lot of distributors and a lot of organisations in different countries that have been hugely generously supportive of the project to date, and of course will very kindly offer to show
You'll
it.
certainly have that support in Ireland. But
Yeah.
before we thank you, Mary, for
Okay.
this amazing
I don't know if
insight. If there's one or two last questions, but Ger,
Yes. The work that was brought in around the film was incredibly generously, the information and research made available to them was very generously shared by where I would, what I would consider the kind of Eileen Gray family experts. I think a wonderful thing happened to me that. There are a lot. Let's see if I can start this again. I'm a filmmaker who from a very privileged place benefited from the research of a lot of extraordinary people. I would, having looked at, I suppose I'll put my foot out there a little bit and say I believe somewhere that Caroline Constant did the most rigorous. Rigorous presentation of what was available to her at the time, and she kind of set the bar. And I can just see the person I'm about to mention in the back of the room.
Jennifer.
I felt, and Jennifer, you might not agree with me, and this is very terrible of me to make a public statement of this kind, but I felt when Caroline came here a few months ago that she was handing the mantle over to the work that has been achieved, particularly by Jennifer.
Yes, she was.
And that I would consider Jennifer, who's standing in the back of this room, the Eileen Gray word expert,
yeah.
Jennifer Goff. And she probably hates me to say, but she is now Dr. Goff. She has done 15 or 18 years, and her book will be out this autumn. And she very generously, has really changed the climate and the atmosphere of Eileen Gray research. For a long time, you mentioned the word ownership. There was a tendency for certain kinds of biographers and people with information to consider their position as owners of that information. I personally don't adhere to that. When you go to make a film, there's no such thing as, you don't buy somebody's life story rights. That doesn't happen. It's not a commodity. The work of Eileen Gray, much of it is in the public domain. Some of it's in production, which is great. There is a license holder for the furniture. I think a wonderful thing happened when Jennifer and when the Pompidou set out to do this exhibition, and then Emma brought the exhibition here, which is that we elevated Eileen Gray's work to the public conscience and to
make it available.
To make it
it's
available
generous.
to the public.
It's an act.
And in the last 3 years around this, when I started doing this project, it did feel like there was a kind of an historical scenario where there were a number of people who had ownership of information and pieces, and that they were guarding them very preciously. And I understand that it's a way of thinking. I just don't happen to share that view. And but what has really, I've watched it change in the last 3 or 4 years, even around the Corbusier side of things, and around E1027
and the
Fondation
Le
Corbusier, that there is this, and I believe Jennifer and Chloe and Peep and Caroline Constant before them, because of their academic approach and their integrous approach, have really changed the climate, and that what we now have the potential to do, and certainly Marco could not have made the documentary without a huge change in attitude, which is that people were willing, and people like Shane, phenomenal what Shane does as an enthusiast and expert on Eileen Gray. I mean, it's phenomenal what you've done over the years to bring this woman's work to the public consciousness. And the only ownership I think we should claim is that we should keep remembering that she was Irish.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end. I'd like to thank you all for coming out today to celebrate two wonderful Irish women, a filmmaker and a historian, who between them are celebrating a wonderful Irish designer, female designer. So, Mary, thank you so much for sharing all that with us. We're dying to see the film.
Thank you very much.